Friends, let me begin by making a few introductory remarks about the symposium. The idea behind the symposium is the understanding that what happened in JNU, what happened in Hyderabad and so on are not just individual episodes, nor is it just the case that we are having a series of episodes of a communal kind, of the kind that we normally are used to when BJP is in power, but that something more is happening, and that is a certain decisive shift is being attempted in the nature of the Indian polity. And this shift requires, from the point of view of those attempting it, an assault on thought. And consequently, anybody who is keen to fight this shift must also fight this assault on thought. And I think that's the basic idea behind this symposium, and an attempt to capture the conjuncture in which we are caught, of which these particular episodes, which are happening one after another, are actually symptoms. What we are witnessing in India today, of course, is that you have a set of fascist elements who are in power. But we don't yet have a fascist state. And what is happening is that the fascist elements are trying to shift the nature of the Indian state in a direction where it does become a fascist state. Now, when one says this, one can be accused of hyperbole, that basically you are really kind of, resorting to hyperbole. But as a matter of fact, the admiration of the RSS, which underlies this government for fascism, is well known, hardly needs any elaboration. And as far as fascist state is concerned, in the Indian conditions, the fascist state basically would have to be of the following kind. Namely, it will have to be a corporate-backed authoritarian state which would be resorting to an extreme form of Hindutva nationalism as is defined by the RSS, which is anti-minority, anti-Dalit, anti-women, and which would be in the service of the so-called nationalism, not only be using the normal repressive organs of the state, like the police and army and so on, but would also be using a bunch of hoodlums on every particular occasion. And this is exactly what we are finding today. And consequently, to say that an attempt is being made to shift the Indian state in the direction of a fascist state is not a hyperbole by any means. Of course, some would call it Hindu Rashtra, but actually Hindu Rashtra in a sense is a bit of a misnomer, because Hindu Rashtra suggests a theocratic state, and given the nature of Hinduism, which in any case is a non-Semitic religion with no kind of book and no church, it's not even clear what a theocratic Hindu Rashtra would look like, because as Romila and others have pointed out, till recently it used to be referred to as a Hindu group of religions. So theocracy is probably not an adequate description of the Hindu Rashtra, but no doubt at all that any Hindu Rashtra would have to be a fascist state. For the simple reason that basically in a country like India, so-called emerging economy and so on, where there is very substantial presence, substantial strengths of corporate entities, any state of that kind would have to have corporate backing. And of course, fascism, as Mussolini himself had described it, is basically a merger of corporate and state power. One can say it's a merger of corporate and state power, which is informed by an aggrandizing, exclusionary, metaphysical nationalism. So the point is that is the direction in which this shift is being attempted. But the precise mechanism of the shift, the precise instruments of the shift, I believe, really consist of a kind of double movement. One movement is to substitute a particular notion of Hindutva nationalism for the anti-colonial nationalism that had existed in the country. Let's not forget that nationalism in India was and is a phenomenal reality. It exists as a phenomenon. The Hindutva brigade is making use of that phenomenal reality of nationalism by substituting an alternative version of it, which is diametrically opposite to it in many ways, for the inclusive anti-colonial nationalism that actually had captured the imagination of the people in this country for a very long time. So the first move that they do is this deception of using the same word but giving it a very different meaning. And the second move they do is that once you actually float this idea of nationalism, once you glorify this alternative nationalism, nobody quite knows what this alternative nationalism is, and you keep putting in all kinds of thoughts into it, where you then say that, you know, if you eat beef, you're being anti-national. If you kind of, you know, don't observe Karwa Chauth, you're being anti-national, and so on. The fact that Rohit Vemulla was a person who was called a casteist by the Hindutva brigade because he was raising his voice against caste oppression. And since casteism is anti-national, anti-whatever their notion of national they have, then it is obvious that if you raise your voice against caste oppression, you become anti-national. Ipso facto, you raise your voice against any kind of oppression, you become anti-national. This kind of a metaphysical notion of nationalism is being substituted, which apotheosizes nationalism above the people, is being substituted for an inclusive anti-colonial nationalism. And then, in the name of this kind of metaphysical nationalism, anything can be filled in. And so by this double move, the attempt is being made to push the country in the direction of a fascist state by this extreme form of Hindutva-defined, RSS-defined nationalism. Now, I think one of the important impediments that they have in this, since this double deceit, as it were, basically runs up against the impediment of a thinking community. I think an assault on thought is required for carrying through this double deceit. An assault on thought is therefore a condition for the Hindutva forces' insurrection against the constitution, because if you want to de facto alter the constitution, push it in the direction of a fascist state, then the prerequisite for that is an assault on thought. The fact that places which are really the most outstanding academic institutions in the country, most outstanding creative institutions in the country, are the ones being targeted, like ANU, University of Hyderabad, the other Pune University, or MS University Baroda, the Fine Arts Department, or Pune Film Institute, and so on. These are the most outstanding institutions which are being targeted, and that is symptomatic of the fact that the project of pushing the state in a fascist direction requires, above all, an assault on thought. Mind you, I believe that the conditions for the assault on thought have already been created by the process of commoditization of education, which has been going on for some time. Obviously, in these days of student protest, inspiring student protest, you don't find private university students really protesting. All these protests, all the resistance actually come from public institutions, publicly funded institutions, and commoditization and privatization of education amounts in any case to an assault on thought, because in such institutions, thought is at a discount. But on these premises, there is this assault on thought to silence even those few places where you actually have students coming up in showing and inspiring kind of resistance that Ram was referring to. One very important implication of this is kind of, worth noticing, and that's the fact that, if you destroy these institutions, then fundamentally, for your thought, you become parasitical on the metropolitan countries. That if there is no JNU, if there is no Hyderabad University, then you basically have to depend on your economics, your sociology, your politics, your history. You have to depend on the American university, you have to depend on the metropolitan universities. In other words, it is interesting that those who are carrying out this assault on thought in the name of a nationalism, in quotes, are actually exposing the country to the intellectual hegemony of precisely the metropolitan institutions. And of course, once you expose it to intellectual hegemony, you expose the country to other forms of hegemony as well. I think, therefore, the understanding that there's something very deep which lies behind this process, and consequently, even though a particular episode may get over, the process of assault on thought will continue, is what has inspired, as it were, this symposium. I will not stand between you and the other speakers, but I think it's quite important that we appreciate, understand, register our protest, and commit ourselves to a resistance against this assault on thought. The first speaker I will call is Prabhat Patnaik, who is the president of JNUTA.